Long before Columbus set sail in 1492, navigators from many other cultures had already ventured across huge oceans. Columbus wasn't the first, so today we're counting down 15 ancient navigators who crossed the oceans before Columbus did. Starting with number 15, the Austronesian navigators of the Pacific. Way long before Columbus, perhaps as early as 1500 BCE, Austronesian-speaking peoples had mastered the art of crossing huge stretches of the Pacific. From their origins in Taiwan and in the northern Philippines, these navigators spread south and east across the Pacific, eventually setting islands as far apart as Madagascar off the coast of Africa and Easter Island in Polynesia. Their maritime achievements are among the most impressive in the world, representing sustained oceanic navigation thousands of years before Europeans even ventured across the Atlantic. The Austronesians relied on outrigger canoes, these are double-hulled vessels, and a deep knowledge of wind, current, and stars. Their craft were not large by modern standards, but they were remarkably seaworthy. Outriggers provide stability, while the double hull offered strength and space for passengers, supplies, and livestock. Oral traditions, archaeological finds, and linguistic evidence all confirm the scope of their journeys. By 1000 BCE, Austronesian navigators had reached as far as Micronesia and Melanesia. By the 1st century CE, Polynesians were exploring and settling remote islands like Hawaii and Rapa Nui. Now, their navigational techniques were based on careful observations. They read the stars for direction, noting specific constellations that rose and set at predictable points on the horizon. They tracked the flight patterns of birds, the swell and refraction of ocean waves, and even the color of the sea to determine the proximity of land. This intimate knowledge of the natural world allowed them to cross distances of thousands of kilometers without compasses or even written charts. The settlement of Madagascar around the 1st millennium CE is one of the most striking proofs of Austronesian navigation. Linguistic analysis shows that Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, is closely related to languages spoken in Borneo. This demonstrates that Austronesian voyagers sailed west across the Indian Ocean, more than 6,000 kilometers from Southeast Asia to Africa. And genetic and archaeological evidence supports this, showing a blend of Southeast Asian and African heritage in Madagascar's population and culture. Archaeology also confirms their presence across the Pacific. Sites in Samoa, Tonga, and the Marquesas show a spread of the Lapita culture, known for its distinctive pottery. These settlements trace the eastward movement of Austronesian voyagers, who carried with them crops like taro, yams, and breadfruit, as well as domesticated animals like pigs and chickens. Their achievements are often compared with those of European explorers, but it's important to note that Austronesian navigation wasn't a single dramatic voyage. It was a centuries-long process of exploration. Their success lay in their ability to transmit navigational techniques orally and train a new generation of navigators who continued the cycle of discovery. By the time the Europeans had first arrived in the Pacific in the 16th century, Polynesians had already established one of the largest maritime networks. From Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south to Easter Island in the east, they had colonized an ocean area larger than all of Europe. These feats required not only skill in navigation, but also the ability to support long voyages, maintain social cohesion, and adapt to new environments. Number 14. Hanno the Navigator of Carthage. Hanno the Navigator was a Carthaginian admiral and explorer who, around the 5th century BCE, led one of the most ambitious voyages of the ancient Mediterranean world. His expedition, recorded in a Greek translation known as the Periplus of Hanno, describes a journey down the west coast of Africa beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that's the Strait of Gibraltar. Hanno's voyage provides rare evidence of ancient attempts to cross the Mediterranean into the Atlantic and extend commercial and geographic knowledge. The Carthaginians were renowned sailors and traders. They inherited maritime skills from their Phoenician ancestors. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage had become the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean, controlling trade routes across North Africa, Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. The Atlantic offered new resources including gold, ivory, and slaves, but it also posed risks due to strong currents, unpredictable wind, and limited knowledge. According to the Periplus of Hanno, the Carthaginian Senate commissioned their expedition, which included 60 ships and tens of thousands of people, suggesting it wasn't merely an exploratory venture, but a colonizing mission. Hanno sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, establishing trade posts along the Moroccan coast, and continued south. He founded or reinforced several settlements, integrating them into Carthage's commercial system. As the expedition proceeded further down the West African coast, Hanno recorded encounters with unfamiliar land, rivers, and peoples. One of the most famous passages describes an island with fire and smoke, possibly a reference to volcanic activity, which some scholars identify with Mount Cameroon. He also mentioned meeting hairy, savage people called gorille who resisted capture. Later interpreters have debated whether this refers to the encounters with apes, perhaps gorillas or chimpanzees, though the exact identification remains uncertain. The farthest extent of Hanno's voyage is still debated. Some scholars believe he reached as far as Sierra Leone, while others suggest he may have gone farther south. Regardless of the exact distance, though, Hanno's journey represents one of the earliest recorded attempts by Mediterranean sailors to explore the Atlantic coast of Africa. His account, preserved in Greek rather than Punic, shows how important this voyage was to later geographers and historians. The voyage was not exploration for its own sake, but a calculated effort to expand commercial influence. Although Hanno's journey didn't lead to sustained colonization far down the Atlantic coast, it set a precedent for later exploration. His periplus influenced Greek and Roman geographers, who used it to imagine the geography of Africa beyond their own experience. Even though many details remain uncertain, the voyage shows the capability of the Carthaginian navigation and the willingness of ancient sailors to push beyond the familiar Mediterranean and into the open ocean. Number 13. Pytheas of Massalia. Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer from the colony of Massalia, which is modern-day Marseille in France, undertook one of the most daring voyages of the ancient world around the 4th century BCE. His journey, recorded in a now-lost work known as On the Ocean, took him beyond the familiar Mediterranean into the Atlantic, reaching as far as the British Isles and possibly even Iceland. Pytheas stands out as one of the earliest known Mediterranean navigators to venture into the northern seas, documenting land, people, and phenomena previously unknown to the classical world. Massalia was a wealthy trading city founded by the Greeks from Phocaea in the 6th century BCE. It sits on the southern coast of France, and it thrived as a commercial hub, connecting the Mediterranean with the hinterlands of Gaul. Pytheas, likely a merchant as well as a scholar, embarked on his voyage to investigate trade opportunities in tin and amber, both highly prized commodities. Tin was vital for producing bronze, while amber was valued as a luxury item. Both came from northern Europe, making exploration of the Atlantic coast essential for expanding Massalia's commercial networks. According to surviving fragments preserved by later authors like Strabo and Pliny the Elder, Pytheas sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic and traveled north along the coast of France and Britain. He was the first Greek known to describe Britain in detail, referring to it as Britannia. He reported that it was a large island inhabited by people who farmed, used grain, and stored it in covered barns. He also noted that the Britons brewed a drink made from a grain and honey, an early reference to beer. But Pytheas' most remarkable claim was that he traveled even farther north to a land he called Thule, located 6 days' sail beyond Britain. He described Thule as a place where the sun barely set in the summer and where the sea was partly frozen, filled with slushy ice. Many scholars today believe Thule refers to Iceland, though some argue it could have been Norway or the Shetland Islands. Whatever the case, Pytheas' account provided the earliest classical description of the Arctic or subarctic regions. Pytheas noted the connection between the moon and the tides, recognizing that the moon's cycles influence the rise and fall of the sea, and this was a significant contribution to ancient science, as no earlier Mediterranean writer had recorded such a link. His mention of the midnight sun in Thule indicates he traveled far enough north to witness extreme seasonal variations in daylight, which confirms the accuracy of at least parts of his journey. But not all of Pytheas' contemporaries believed him. Strabo dismissed much of his account as fantasy, claiming Pytheas lied about distant lands to gain fame. However, modern scholarship has re-evaluated Pytheas' work and found that many of his observations align with reality. His descriptions of northern agriculture, the amber trade in the Baltic, and the Arctic environment are all remarkably accurate, given the limitations of his time. Number 12. Wei Shen and the Buddhist monks of Fusang. One of the more intriguing records of early transoceanic voyages comes from Chinese sources, describing the journey of the Buddhist monk Wei Shen. who in the 5th century CE reportedly traveled to a distant land called Fusang. The account, preserved in the Book of Liang, compiled in the 7th century, describes Wei Shen's journey across the Pacific Ocean to a country located thousands of miles east of China. While the precise location of Fusang remains debated, the story reflects the remarkable capabilities of Chinese and Buddhist seafarers long before European exploration. According to the Book of Liang, Wei Shen was an Indian monk who traveled from Kabul to China and then continued eastward by sea around the year 458 CE. He claimed to have reached Fusang, a land 20,000 li, that's roughly 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers east of China. Fusang was described as a country with advanced agriculture, written records, and Buddhist practices. Wei Shen said he spent several years there, spreading Buddhist teachings before returning to China to recount his journey. This account describes Fusang as a land where people used a plant called the Fusang tree for food, clothing, and paper. It also mentions that the inhabitants lived in wooden houses, practiced monogamy, and had a system of government. Most strikingly, Wei Shen reported that Buddhist monks and temples were already present in Fusang, suggesting that religion had spread there before his arrival. The biggest question surrounding this voyage, though, is the location of Fusang. Some scholars of the past speculated that it could have been in the Americas, perhaps Mexico, citing similarities between the Fusang plant and agave or maize. Others argue that Fusang referred to Japan or the Kuril Islands, which would have been closer to China and more plausible given the technology of the time. Modern scholarship tends to view the identification of Fusang with the Americas as unlikely, since no clear evidence supports any trans-Pacific contact at this early a date. However, there's no doubt that Wei Shen's voyage illustrates the reach of Chinese maritime travel in the 5th century. The Chinese ships of the time were capable of long voyages. They were equipped with sails, rudders, and hulls large enough to carry hundreds of passengers and significant cargo, and the Chinese had also developed the use of the compass by the early centuries CE, although it's unclear whether it was employed in navigation as early as Wei Shen's journey. But even without the compass, Chinese and Buddhist sailors relied on the stars, ocean currents, and seasonal wind, particularly the monsoons, to guide their travel. Number 11. Leif Erikson and the Norse voyagers to Vinland. Among the best documented cases of pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages are the Norse explorations of North America around the year 1000 CE, led by Leif Erikson. The Norse sagas, combined with archaeological evidence, provide strong confirmation that Norse sailors from Greenland reached the coast of North America centuries before Columbus. Unlike other stories of ocean crossings, the Norse voyages are supported by material remains, making them one of the most solidly verifiable examples of ancient transoceanic navigation. Leif Erikson was the son of Eric the Red, who had founded the Norse settlements in Greenland in the late 10th century. According to the Saga of Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, Leif heard stories from another sailor, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course and sighted unknown lands west of Greenland. Inspired, Leif organized an expedition around the year 1000 and sailed west with a crew. The sagas describe how Leif and his men encountered several new lands. The first, called Helluland, the land of flat stones, is generally identified with Baffin Island. The second, Markland, land of forests, is thought to be Labrador, noted for its abundant timber. The third and most fertile, Vinland, the land of vines, is often associated with Newfoundland, where wild grapes or berries grow. Leif and his crew built houses and spent at least one winter there, exploring the area and collecting resources before returning to Greenland. The most compelling evidence of the Norse in North America comes from Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland, where archaeologists uncovered remains of a Norse settlement in the 1960s. The site includes turf houses, iron nails, and other artifacts identical to those found in Greenland and Iceland. Radiocarbon dating, too, places the site around the year 1000, perfectly matching the saga's accounts. Lanso Meadows proves that Norse sailors did indeed sail across the Atlantic and establish a foothold in North America centuries before Columbus. Those Norse voyages were possible thanks to their seafaring tech. Viking ships, especially the Nar, were sturdy cargo vessels designed for long ocean crossings. They had wide hulls, deep keels, and square sails, making them capable of carrying supplies and enduring the rough sea. Norse sailors used the sun, stars, bird flights, and even the color of the sea to guide them, and there is evidence they also employed sunstones, which were crystals that could detect the sun's position through the clouds, though this remains debated. Despite their success, though, the Norse settlements in North America were short-lived. The sagas mention conflicts with the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skrælings. These encounters may have been hostile, limiting Norse expansion. The distance from Greenland and the small population base of the Norse colonies also made sustaining Vinland difficult. By the early 11th century, regular voyages to Vinland had ceased, and the Greenland settlements themselves eventually declined. Number 10. The Egyptian expedition to Punt. Among the earliest recorded oceanic voyages in human history are the Egyptian expeditions to the land of Punt, a region located to the south of Egypt along the Red Sea coast, probably in modern Eritrea, Djibouti, or Somalia. Punt was known for producing incense, myrrh, ivory, exotic animals, and goods that were highly valued in Egyptian religion and culture. Egyptian inscriptions and reliefs describe these voyages, which require substantial maritime skill to cross the Red Sea, with cargoes of rare commodities. The most famous of these expeditions occurred during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE. Her mortuary temple contained detailed reliefs depicting ships sailing to Punt, the presentation of goods, and the interactions with the Punite ruler and his queen. These images provide some of the best evidence of early long-distance sea voyages. They show large ships with sails and oars, laden with provisions and crew members, which suggests careful planning and organization. According to the inscriptions, the Egyptians brought back incense trees, which were planted in temple gardens, as well as gold, ebony, ivory, and animals like baboons. These imports were essential for temple rituals, where incense played a central role in offerings to the gods. The expeditions to Punt were therefore not merely commercial ventures, but they were religious missions that reinforced the pharaoh's legitimacy and divine favor. Other pharaohs also organized expeditions to Punt. Records from the reigns of Pepi II in the Old Kingdom and Amenemhat II in the Middle Kingdom mention contacts with Punt. These references show that Egyptian management with Punt spanned over 1,000 years, making it one of the most enduring examples of oceanic trade. Now, the exact route of the expeditions is uncertain, but it's likely that ships sailed down the Red Sea, hugging the coast until they reached Punt. Egyptian ships of the time were built of planks lashed together with ropes, strengthened with beams, and propelled by sails and oars. Though not as advanced as the later vessels, they were capable of making the journey across relatively narrow but challenging waters of the Red Sea. The identity of Punt has been debated by historians, though, but archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly points to the Horn of Africa. Analysis of mummified baboons found in Egypt suggests that they originated in Eritrea or Somalia, supporting the identification of Punt in that region. But the significance of these voyages to Punt lies in the antiquity. Taking place more than 1,000 years before Homer and 2 millennia before the Roman Empire, these expeditions demonstrate that oceanic navigation was practiced very early in human history. They showed that ancient peoples were not confined to rivers and coastlines, but were capable of organizing long voyages across open water to secure essential goods. Number 9. Bjarni Herjolfsson. While Leif Erikson is remembered as the Norse explorer who first set foot in North America, it was Bjarni Herjolfsson who arguably paved the way. His voyage, which took place around 986 CE, represents one of the earliest recorded European sightings of the American continent. Unlike Leif, Bjarni didn't land and settle, but his accidental encounter with unknown lands west of Greenland provided the inspiration for the later Norse expeditions. Bjarni was a Norwegian merchant who sailed regularly between Norway and Greenland. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, while traveling to visit his father in Greenland, Bjarni's ship was blown off course by storms. Instead of finding Greenland, he and his crew sighted unfamiliar coastlines. The sagas describe how they saw several new lands, one that was forested, another with low hills, and a third with a rocky shoreline. Bjarni focused on reaching Greenland, didn't stop to explore, but he still recorded what he had seen. When Bjarni finally reached Greenland, he recounted his journey and many criticized him for failing to investigate. Nevertheless, his story spread, and it eventually reached Leif Erikson. Motivated by Bjarni's description, Leif set out on his own expedition, leading the Norse to landings in North America. In this way, Bjarni's accidental discovery indirectly shaped the course of transatlantic exploration. Historians generally identify the lands Bjarni saw as parts of North America, perhaps Labrador, Newfoundland, or even Baffin Island. And his failure to land makes it difficult to be precise, but the descriptions in the sagas correspond reasonably well with the geography of eastern Canada. Unlike myths or legends, Bjarni's story is grounded in Norse sources, which have proven reliable in other respects, especially given the archaeological confirmation of the Norse presence at Lansometos. Bjarni's voyage, though, highlights the strengths and the limits of Norse navigation. Viking sailors were highly skilled, using the sun, stars, and ocean currents and coastal features to guide them. Yet storms could easily push them far off course, and without compasses, recovery was difficult. What made Bjarni unusual was his refusal to exploit the discovery. Unlike most explorers who would have seized the chance to investigate the new lands, Bjarni prioritized his original goal of reuniting with his father in Greenland. Perhaps this conservative choice cost him fame in his own time, but it preserved his reputation as the man who glimpsed America before anyone else in Europe admitted to it. Number 8. Faxi and the Norse settlement of Iceland. Before the Norse reached Greenland and North America, they first had to master the North Atlantic step by step. One of the earliest navigators remembered for opening a new frontier was Faxi, often credited in Icelandic tradition as one of the first to sight Iceland in the 9th century CE. Though not as well documented as later voyages, his role illustrates how Norse exploration unfolded gradually, each step building on earlier voyages into the Atlantic. The story of Faxi comes from Icelandic sagas, which recount that around 860 CE, a group of Norse sailors, including Nadad, Gardar Svaransson, and Faxi, reached Iceland. According to tradition, Faxi gave his name to Faxaflói, the bay near modern Reykjavik, after sighting the land. While the sagas were written centuries after the events, they preserve a memory of how Iceland entered the Norse world through the voyages of explorers and traders. Iceland's discovery was significant because it represented a leap farther west from the familiar coasts of Scandinavia and the British Isles. The journey required sailing across several days of open ocean, navigating with limited tools, and the Norse ships, however, were well suited for the task. Their clinker-built design with overlapping planks gave them flexibility and strength. The square sails combined with oars allowed for both long-distance travel and maneuverability. These ships, whether longships or cargo vessels, were the key to Norse expansion. The sagas also describe how the early explorers found Iceland uninhabited except for a few Irish hermits, known as the Papar, who may have lived there before the Norse settlement. Iceland did offer rich grazing lands, abundant fish, and resources that appealed to settlers. Within a few decades of its first discovery, permanent Norse colonies were established, beginning around 874 CE with Ingolf Arnarson, traditionally considered the first settler. Faxi's role as one of the discoverers reflects how Norse exploration was often collective rather than individual. Unlike Columbus's voyage, which is tied to one man's name, Norse expansion into the Atlantic was carried out by groups of sailors, merchants, and settlers. Each voyage added new knowledge, which was preserved orally and passed down to future generations. The naming of Faxaflói ensures that Faxi's contribution, though modest compared to Leif Erikson or Eric the Red, is still remembered as part of the tradition. The discovery and settlement of Iceland paved the way for the further voyages. From Iceland, Norse sailors could reach Greenland, and from Greenland they eventually pushed into North America. Without the first step of colonizing Iceland, the later Norse presence in Vinland would not have been possible. Iceland itself then became a crucial hub in the Norse maritime network, linking Scandinavia, the British Isles, Greenland, and beyond. Moving on to number 7, Eric the Red and the colonization of Greenland. Eric the Red, the father of Leif Erikson, was one of the most significant Norse navigators and settlers of the North Atlantic. Around the late 10th century CE, he led the expedition that established the first lasting European colonies in Greenland. His achievements show the pattern of Norse expansion, exploration, settlement, and integration into wider maritime networks that stretched across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. Eric was born in Norway around 950 CE, but moved to Iceland with his family after his father was exiled for manslaughter. This background shaped his life, as Eric himself was later exiled from Iceland for killings related to local disputes. Rather than retreat into obscurity, Eric turned his punishment into an opportunity by sailing westward to lands that had been sighted but not permanently settled. According to the sagas, Eric had heard of lands seen by Gunnbjorn Ulfsson decades earlier when storms had blown his ship west of Iceland. Seizing the chance, Eric led an expedition and reached Greenland around 982 CE. He explored the coast for 3 years, mapping fjords and identifying potential sites for settlement. When his period of exile ended, he returned to Iceland to recruit settlers. He cleverly named the new land Greenland, claiming that a favorable name would attract more colonists. This marketing strategy worked, and in 986 CE, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships from Iceland, of which 14 successfully reached Greenland with livestock, supplies, and people. Greenland's importance extended beyond survival. It became a stepping stone for voyages further west, including those led by Leif Erikson to North America. Navigation to Greenland was challenging. The sailors typically followed a route from Iceland, crossing about 1,500 kilometers of open sea, and they relied on their experience with the stars, the sun, and the wind, as well as practical signs like the presence of seabirds and floating driftwood. Eric's success in leading settlers across this route shows both his personal skill and the robustness of Norse maritime traditions. By the time Columbus sailed, the Norse presence in Greenland had vanished, yet Eric the Red's achievement remains central in the history of oceanic navigation. By establishing a permanent European foothold in Greenland, he extended the range of Norse exploration, and he set the stage for transatlantic contact centuries before Columbus. Number 6. Abu Bakr II of Mali. While most navigators on this list are associated with the North Atlantic or the Pacific, one of the most intriguing accounts comes from West Africa. According to Arab chroniclers, Abu Bakr II, the ruler of the Mali Empire in the early 14th century, is said to have launched a transatlantic expedition decades before Columbus. While details are limited and some aspects remain debated, the story reflects the maritime ambitions of Mali and the possibility of African attempts to cross the Atlantic. The primary source comes from the Arab historian al-Umari, who recorded an account in Cairo in the 14th century. According to al-Umari, Abu Bakr II was fascinated by the ocean and determined to explore its limits. He reportedly sent out an expedition of 200 ships filled with men and supplies, but only one ship returned, its captain claiming that the others had been swept away by a powerful current. Undeterred, Abu Bakr II allegedly abdicated his throne, appointing his brother Mansa Musa as successor, and he personally led a second expedition of 2,000 ships. This fleet sailed westward into the Atlantic and was never seen again. The story is remarkable, not least because Mansa Musa went on to become one of the most famous rulers of Mali, celebrated for his pilgrimage to Mecca. But what evidence supports the account? Well, the most direct source is al-Umari's report, based on conversations with Mansa Musa himself. While it can't confirm that the expedition reached the Americas, it does suggest that large-scale attempts to cross the Atlantic were undertaken from West Africa. The Mali Empire certainly had the resources for such an undertaking. At its height, Mali was one of the wealthiest states in the world, controlling gold mines that supplied much of the Mediterranean economy. Its rulers commanded huge manpower and could assemble large fleets of riverine and ocean-going boats. While Mali was primarily a land-based empire, the Niger River and access to the Atlantic coast provided a maritime outlet. But modern scholars remain divided. Some view the story as plausible yet unprovable, while others argue it may have been exaggerated. What is certain about the account, though, is it reflects a tradition of maritime interest in West Africa long before European exploration. Number 5. Zheng He and the treasure fleets of Ming China. Though Zheng He lived in the early 15th century, only a few decades before Columbus, his voyage across the Indian Ocean showed the scale and sophistication of Chinese navigation long before Europeans dominated the seas. Born in 1371 in Yunnan Province, Zheng He was captured as a boy during Ming campaigns against the remnants of the Yuan dynasty. Castrated and brought to court, he rose to become a trusted eunuch and military commander. In 1405, he was appointed to lead what became the most ambitious naval expedition in Chinese history. The Ming treasure fleets were remarkable for their size. Contemporary accounts claim they included hundreds of ships, with the largest, so-called treasure ships, measuring up to 120 meters long, far larger than any vessels in Europe at the time. Their purpose was to project Chinese power, collect tribute, and expand diplomatic and commercial ties across the Indian Ocean. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He commanded 7 major voyages. His fleets traveled from China through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean to India, Sri Lanka, and the Persian Gulf, and as far as the Swahili coast of East Africa. These voyages showed both the reach of the Chinese naval power and the Ming dynasty's interest in global trade. What Zheng He accomplished was bringing China into a system of an unprecedented scale. His fleets carried porcelain, silk, and lacquerware, which were exchanged for spices, precious stones, ivory, and exotic animals. And famously, Zheng He brought giraffes from Africa back to the Ming court, where they were seen as symbols of cosmic harmony. Despite the success of these expeditions, they were eventually discontinued. After the death of the emperor and shifts in court politics, the Ming dynasty turned inward, focusing on defending its northern borders and reducing maritime spending. Zheng He's legacy endures as proof of China's maritime capability before Columbus. His voyages showed that massive fleets could traverse the oceans. Number 4. Saint Brendan the Navigator. One of the most famous figures in medieval exploration is Saint Brendan of Clonfert, a 6th century Irish monk whose legendary voyage to a far western land became one of Europe's most enduring stories. Known as Brendan the Navigator, he's remembered through the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, the voyage of Saint Brendan the Abbot. This is a Latin text from the 9th century that describes his journey across the Atlantic. While details are interwoven with myth and religious symbolism, the story reflects the seafaring culture of early medieval Ireland, and it raises the possibility that Irish monks undertook voyages centuries before the Norse. According to the story, Brendan and a group of fellow monks set out in a leather-clad boat to find the promised land of the saints. They encountered a series of marvels, including islands of fire, crystal pillars rising from the sea, and talking birds. Eventually, after years of wandering, they reached a fertile land across the ocean, which some later traditions identified with North America. Historians do debate how much of Brendan's story is based on real voyages, though, and how much is allegory. The text was intended as a religious narrative, emphasizing faith, endurance, and divine guidance. Yet the Irish monks were known for their maritime skill. They built and sailed curraghs across the rough waters of the North Atlantic, reaching the Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, and even Iceland well before the Norse. Modern experiments support the possibility. In 1976, explorer Tim Severin built a replica using traditional materials, wooden frame, leather hides, and tar, and successfully sailed from Ireland to Newfoundland. His voyage showed that Brendan's journey, at least in practical terms, could have been possible using early medieval Irish technology. The significance of Brendan's story, though, lies less in whether he personally reached America, and more in what it represents. It shows that Europeans in the early medieval period already imagined lands across the ocean and possessed the seafaring skill to reach them. It also shows how exploration could be framed in religious terms, as a spiritual quest rather than a search for trade or conquest. Number 3. Polynesian voyages to Hawaii. One of the greatest achievements in world navigation before Columbus was the Polynesian settlement of Hawaii. Located in the Central Pacific, more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest major landmass, Hawaii was reached and colonized by Polynesian navigators centuries before European contact. These voyages required extraordinary skill, organization, and courage, ranking among the most impressive feats of open ocean navigation in human history. The Polynesian navigators used double-hulled canoes capable of carrying people, animals, and supplies across big distances. These vessels, constructed with lashings and wooden planks, were both stable and fast, designed for long ocean voyages. The navigators memorized the rising and setting positions of stars and used this knowledge to maintain a course at night. During the day, they watched the flight of seabirds, which would indicate the direction of nearby islands. The first settlers to Hawaii brought with them the plants and animals essential for survival. They introduced taro, breadfruit, coconuts, pigs, chickens, and dogs, which created the foundations of Hawaiian agriculture and society. These transported ecosystems, sometimes called a canoe package, showed the planning and foresight required for colonization. The voyages weren't random drifts, but elaborate expeditions designed to establish permanent settlements. The significance of the Hawaiian settlement does lie in its distance. Unlike islands closer to the Polynesian homeland, Hawaii required sustained voyages across open ocean, with no visible land for weeks. Reaching it confirmed that the Polynesians had developed one of the most advanced non-European systems of navigation in history. By the time Captain James Cook arrived in 1778, Hawaiians had already lived there for centuries, maintaining a thriving culture. Number 2. The Phoenician expedition around Africa. Among the earliest recorded long-distance voyages is the Phoenician circumnavigation of Africa, commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II around the 6th century BCE. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, preserved the account. According to his report, Phoenician sailors departed from the Red Sea, sailed down the east coast of Africa, rounded the southern tip, and returned through the Mediterranean to Egypt. If accurate, this would be the earliest known circumnavigation of the African continent, a journey of extraordinary scale that took 3 years to complete. Herodotus records the Phoenicians sailed south from the Red Sea, stopping each autumn to plant crops on shore, which they harvested before continuing their journey. After rounding the southern tip of Africa, what we now call the Cape of Good Hope, they returned north along the west coast. The most striking detail in the account, though, is that the sailors claim that the sun was on their right while sailing westwards. Modern historians see this as powerful evidence of authenticity, since only someone who had actually crossed into the southern hemisphere would observe the sun to the north. Skeptics, though, have questioned whether the Phoenicians could have completed such a voyage with ancient technology, yet their ships were sturdy and coastal navigation made the journey feasible, if time-consuming. The mention of farming en route also fits with ancient maritime practice, where crews often stop for months to resupply. If the circumnavigation did happen, it represents one of the greatest achievements of ancient navigation. It also underscores the connection between commerce and exploration. Egypt's interest in the voyage likely stemmed from the desire to access trade routes and resources along the African coast. Whether or not the entire circumnavigation was completed, the account reflects the ambitions of the ancient sailors. Skills in shipbuilding and navigation here set the stage for later seafaring cultures, from the Carthaginians to the Romans. Number 1. The Genoese expedition of 1291, the Vivaldi brothers. In 1291, 2 Genoese brothers, Ugolino and Vadino Vivaldi, set out on one of the boldest voyages of the Middle Ages. Their goal was nothing less than to reach India by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean centuries before Columbus. Though their fate remains uncertain and their expedition ended in disappearance, the Vivaldi brothers' attempt demonstrates how the idea of crossing the ocean to reach Asia existed in Europe long before the 15th century. Genoa in the late 13th century was one of the great maritime republics. Along with Venice, Pisa, and Amalfi, Genoa competed for dominance. Genoese bankers deeply enmeshed in European finance, while its shipbuilders produced some of the finest vessels in the world. Genoa's prosperity rested on its ability to combine commercial ambition with their naval expertise. The details we do know of the voyage come from later chronicles. The most important is the account of Jacopo Doria, a Genoese chronicler who recorded the expedition shortly after it departed. According to his report, Ugolino and Vadino Vivaldi outfitted 2 galleys with supplies and crews of around 300 men. Their stated objective was to go by the ocean sea to the ports of India. Well, they departed from Genoa in May of 1291, sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and ventured into the Atlantic. From there, the record becomes uncertain. What became of the expedition is one of history's mysteries. Contemporary records fall silent after the galleys passed Gibraltar, and later accounts offer conflicting reports. Some suggest Vivaldi sailed down the coast of Africa and were never heard from. Others claim they reached the Canary Islands, which were just becoming known to Europeans around this time. Still later in the 15th century, explorers like Cadamosto claim to have heard stories of descendants of the Vivaldis living among African peoples. While none of these reports can be verified, they do show the enduring memory of the voyage. The fact that Genoese chroniclers and later explorers continued to speak of the Vivaldi brothers suggests that their attempt was taken seriously. The expedition also shows how medieval Europeans understood geography. By the 13th century, educated Europeans were aware, through classical sources like Aristotle and Ptolemy, that the Earth was spherical. They didn't believe in a flat Earth, but they underestimated the size of the world. Many thought Asia lay much closer across the Atlantic than it actually does. The Vivaldis, like Columbus 2 centuries later, may have believed that a westward voyage to India was feasible with the supplies and ships they had. The expedition also shows how exploration is often driven by individuals in the margins of empires. Genoa wasn't a territorial empire like France or England, but a city-state of merchants and sailors. Its ventures were privately financed, motivated by profit as much by glory. The entrepreneurial model set the stage for later European voyages of discovery, many of which relied on private capital and merchant backing rather than purely royal initiative. In this way, the Vivaldis foreshadowed the structure of the Age of Exploration. Their voyage showed that the Atlantic Ocean was not an impassable void, but a sea that could be entered, though at great peril. When Columbus later sought support for his expedition, he was building on a long tradition of Mediterranean maritime enterprise, of which the Vivaldis were among the most daring examples.